In this video, I'm going to show you how to use 3 unique tools that come standard with your Vectric software to make this really lovely clock. We just returned from AWFS. It's a big trade show in Las Vegas that happens every 2 years. It's a great opportunity for us to see customers in the US and also to see other CNC manufacturers out there that provide our software with their machines. We bring all kinds of samples with us and we get to meet all kinds of great people, including users. Quite often the users will take a look at the samples that we have and ask lots of questions about them. And in this case, for the first time, we had a lot of people picking up these samples, which are little foam textured tiles. They had questions, and 2 of the main questions they had were, can we make this in our Vectric software? And how can we make this in our Vectric software? And so I thought this project might be a great opportunity to go over how we do this sort of thing. Now, we've already shown this off several times in different projects, including the Dart box that David and I did a little while ago, which was a great use of this. But what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through the Vector Texture Creator, and then also the Texture Toolpath. And then I want to show you a really interesting way to use those toolpaths to make a really cool project, and that's the clock. So hang around to the end because you're going to need a little bit of extra information besides just how to use these 2 tools to get that job done. So right now I have vcarve Pro open, and it's just a blank job. There's nothing special about this job. The dimensions are about 300 by 300 millimeters, and the thickness is about 25 millimeters. We're going to need to keep that in mind as we play with these tools. The first thing I want to point out is that these textures can be created with all kinds of different actual cutters. We've got a V-bit that will create something like this sort of a wood grain texture. We've got all sorts of different size bullnose cutters, and they'll create all kinds of interesting textures like this larger one that we have here, which is really quite nice in the end. So when you're thinking about using this tool, you might want to think about what cutters you have on hand and what different results you can get by using those cutters. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to take a look at the Vector Texture Creator. So we're going to click on that. And this tool is used to create the vectors that we may or may not want to use later on when we create our Texture Toolpath. There's some really easy settings here. It's not very complicated, but the more you play around with it, the more power you're going to see in this. We start off by choosing the angle that we want our vectors to be created at. And right now it's at 90, and we'll put it back to 0 here, just in the center. We have the line spacing, so we can decide how far apart these lines are going to be. We have a variation here. So this is kind of like adds a little bit of randomness to that maximum spacing so that you get kind of a nice, interesting look like that bigger panel you saw a second ago. We can change the amplitude, which is the up and down of your waves. We can change the wavelength of those. Again, both of those, you can add in a little bit of variation. And then also we can play around with some noise, and that's where you'll get this kind of a wood grain kind of effect if you use that. Then we have the option to place our vectors on their own layer, which I highly suggest you do, and make sure that everything is kind of neat and tidy and you know where to go find those vectors. So for right now, I'm just going to keep those settings exactly the way they are, and we're going to preview what we're going to get. And you'll see that it actually fills the whole space, my whole job space, which is great. It looks really good. And I can change these. So let's go ahead and change our variation here a little bit, and we'll preview that again. And you'll see now we're getting sort of a random sort of spacing in between those. We can change our amplitude if we'd like to. And we'll hit preview again. We haven't committed to anything here. This all looks interesting. We can also go ahead and change our wavelength to be really short if we want to, and preview that. And then we can add in some noise if we'd like to and preview that. So you can see how you can get all kinds of really interesting vectors to use or to work with. Now, you don't need to just use these in the Texture Toolpath. You can use these for any kind of design you want to, but in our case, we're actually going to use these in conjunction with that toolpath. So let's just go ahead now and turn down the noise again. Let's change the wavelength back to 10. We'll make this 12. We'll make this 15. And we'll go preview, and that should look, whoa, that's a little bit crazy. So let's just change our amplitude to be like 3 till we get something that looks good. Wavelength, I'll make this 5. See how you can just play around with these, and you can make these as long as you'd like. There we go, that looks pretty good. So let's go with that. And let's just go and accept that. And you'll see that, as I said, I asked it to put it on your own vector texture layer. So we have a new layer up here called vector texture. So if I had a design, I could be on a different layer if I would like. Now let's jump over to our Toolpaths tab. Well, before we do that, it's good to note that these are all grouped together when you create them, which again makes it kind of nice. If you forget to put them on their own layer, then you can quickly kind of move them around if you need to. Or you need to ungroup them, or you need them for some other task, like you're going to trim things, and you're going to need to ungroup them. So just don't forget that they're all grouped together. So the toolpath we're going to be looking for over here is the one right here, which is the texturing toolpath. So we're going to click on that. And the first thing we need to do is to, like any other toolpath, is to select a tool. So in my case, I'm going to use a 1-inch ball nose end mill. And that's this fella right here. He's quite big. Now I haven't used this ever before, except for this one job. So I'll be a little bit, careful when I choose my feeds and my speeds for this. And if I was going to make this clock again, I certainly would have gone through and made a couple test parts so I could test the proper feeds and speeds. I have to say it was a little bit worrisome when we cut the clock. It seemed to be cut a little bit deep, but everything worked out perfectly fine. But if you want to not worry about that anxiety, then certainly it'd be a good idea to cut a few test parts with that. We have the option of choosing a start depth like we do with most toolpaths. We can use selected vectors. So we're going to go ahead right now and do that. We'll use selected vectors. And I can also choose to ramp at the start and the end. This is like our fluting toolpath where we can ramp in at the first and then do some work and then pop out the other end nice and smooth. It gives us kind of a nice transition opposed to just diving right in. With this bigger panel that you saw a minute ago, there was no ramping involved at all. But when I make my clock, we're going to make sure to turn that on because we want it to be kind of special in that way. Because I've chosen some vectors, I can choose my maximum cut depth if I would like to. And this is going to be set to 12 millimeters right now, which we can just fool around with later on if we'd like to. We can also project our toolpaths onto a 3D model, which that is really exciting for somebody like me that likes to do a lot of 3D stuff. We're not going to explore that much in this project, but it certainly is something I think that has lots of legs and maybe we might look at in future projects. And let's just go ahead and calculate that. And there we have it, and you can see that we've got a nice toolpath going on there. That looks really good. So let's preview that visible toolpath and we'll see what we get. Now I've got my resolution of my simulation turned way up, so it's going to take a little bit of time to generate this. Now one of the things I forgot to mention earlier when we were creating this texture or the vectors for this texture toolpath is that you could actually choose a vector shape like a circle and create those vectors right inside that shape or between two different shapes. So if you want to isolate those, you can. That's a great technique if you're going to put a texture like this in the background of a sign where you're going to be choosing the border, maybe some middle text that you want it to avoid. Then you can go ahead and do that and you'll only get those vectors created in between those vectors that you have selected. That's a great, like I said, a great use of the texture toolpath. Now, like I said, we've used this for all kinds of things in the past. I really suggest that when you're thinking about a project and you really want to jazz it up a little bit, that choosing the texture toolpath is a great way to do it. In this case, you've only seen me use vectors, but you can do some really cool stuff without choosing vectors if you would like to as well. And once this is all done generating, we'll explore that as well. That looks really good. Now, another thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is that you're more than likely want to create your texture toolpath bigger than the area that you need it to be, especially if you're going to have the texture go right up to the edge, because the geometry of your tool will overhang that. And so you're going to want, let's say I wanted to create a square from this, I'd actually create a vector square inside this and then do a profile cut and just keep the middle bit, because I don't want all this edge stuff that's going on there. So that's really neat. So let's go back to our preview. Let's reset that for a sec. Let's close this down. And let's go back into that toolpath for just a quick second and have a look at some of these other options. Like I said, you can change the tool if you'd like to. Let's just say I'll select a V-bit here for this, just for the fun of it. A standard V-bit that we use all the time. And we'll just recalculate that. Then we'll preview that visible toolpath and we'll see what we come up with. Now, because I'm going quite deep with this, it's really going to look a little bit funny. But again, with tweaking a little bit, you're going to get a really cool toolpath in the end. So So we've gone quite deep there, but let's just, let's go back into our toolpath again. And let's just change the maximum cut depth to be like 5 millimeters. And then we'll recalculate that, and we can reset that preview, and then we'll preview that. And again, I really suggest that you go in and play around with this. And now I'm getting more of a streaky texture like I was kind of hoping for. That looks really neat. I like that a lot. Okay, let's go reset that. Let's close this down. And let's go back into that toolpath again. And let's just explore one more part of this. If I go ahead and unclick the use selected vector as a pattern, then I have this extra set of options that I can choose from. I'm just going to use this tool, and I'm going to create a random pattern that's going to show me a maximum cut. We're going to use a maximum cut depth. I've got some variation in there, a maximum cut length, an overlap, so that's more or less how much these are going to overlap with each other. The step over, which is how many lines we're going to have, and then we have the angle. So let's just go ahead and calculate that up really quick. And let's preview that visible toolpath, and we'll see what we end up with. So you get a kind of a neat little chiseled look. If we close this down, and let's just say we make those a little bit longer maybe. Let's change our maximum cut length. We'll make this like, let's just make it 100 millimeters, okay? And let's calculate that. That's okay. It's because I've got some vectors selected here in the 2D view, which I don't need. So let's reset that preview, and let's preview that visible toolpath. And now we're getting these nice swoopy bits that look pretty neat. That looks pretty good. We can now go ahead and change maybe the overlap. Let's change this to be like 50%, and let's calculate that. And then we can reset that preview and preview that visible toolpath. And now we're going to get even longer, and you see it has this sort of randomness to the end of it. It looks kind of like maybe a skin or like an animal skin or something like that. That looks really neat. So as you can see, there's all kinds of stuff that you can do when you combine the vector texture creator and the vector texture tool, or the texture toolpath. And again, those together are a perfect combination, creating your vectors. And you can use any vectors. You don't need to use the ones from the vector texture tool. You can use whatever you like to, but that certainly makes it a lot easier to come up with some really cool kind of shapes. Now, I did use those two tools for the clock, and the clock turned out really neat in the end. But as you can see, there's something slightly different about this clock, is that I've actually bent those vectors around the outside of this to kind of give it a bit of I guess a sun look or a flame look or something like that, whatever you like to call it. So what I want to do is I want to show you how I did that in the end. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a pretty basic file. And this file would be what you would need to use if you were going to make just the clock without any texture. So let's have a look at this file. I'm in the 3D view right now, and you can see that I've got a two-sided job open, and you can see the vectors from the other side. Now on the top side, I've got this outside vector, which is the profile of my clock shape. And then on the other side, I've got an outside vector, and that's for a larger pocket so I can get my hands in the back, because this wood is quite thick. So I can put in the actual clock mechanism into this smaller square here. And then there's a circle in the middle that we're going to use to poke the, I guess it's the clock dial, I guess that's what you call it, out through the back onto the front so I can reassemble all the bits of the clock mechanism. Now I want to point out this clock mechanism we didn't buy straight off the shelf. It came from another clock that we've actually taken this out of. So if you're going to go ahead and redo this job, you're going to want to make sure that those vectors on the back side are the correct size and cut to the correct depth to make sure that your mechanism will fit in there appropriately. So let's have a quick look at what I've got here. So I've got 3 toolpaths already created for you. There's a chamfer toolpath, a cutout toolpath, which is only going to cut halfway through my material. And then I've got some dowel holes. It's a double-sided job. Now, if you haven't done a double-sided job before, we've got tons of tutorials on vectric.com where you can go and check those out, and you can learn a little bit more about that. Equally, if I haven't described all the features of the texture or vector texture creator and also the Texture Toolpath, then we've got another 2 videos that dive right into that hardcore, and also a few other free projects like I mentioned before that you can go ahead and explore on your own to learn more about those. So let's have a quick look at that. Now I chose the chamfer toolpath, by the way, because I wanted to give it a bit of a bevel around the top edge. And if we flip over to the other side, you'll see that we have 5 different toolpaths. We've got the dowel holes that we're going to cut directly into our spoil board after we remove our front cuts, or our front, and once we cut our front, we're going to move that out of the way and then cut our dowel holes into our spoil board. And then I've got a large pocket, and that's for this larger vector here. We've got a clock mechanism toolpath, that's for this one here. All of these use a 1/4 inch end mill. And then we have the dial hole, which again uses a 1/4 inch end mill. It cuts all the way through. And then we have the leftover of our cutout pass, which cuts through the other half of our job. Some of the important things I want to point out about this for you is that my tabs for my cutout pass are on the bottom and the top of the clock because it just sort of barely fit within the width of my material. And a lot of these I'm going to use a pocket allowance for, so that I can oversize things a little bit to fit all the parts that I needed to fit in there. So be sure to check all those allowances to make sure that they're okay. Also, make sure that you check all the feeds and speeds for all of these to make sure they're safe and appropriate for your machine. So let's flip back over to the front of our job again, and let's preview all of the tool paths we have. So we can see what this, if we cut it just as it is, this is what we get. We've got our chamfer, we've got our profile toolpath, we have our dowel holes, and this is the back side now. We have that larger pocket being cut, then we've got that smaller pocket being cut, and then we've got the hole in the center for the dial, and then we've got a leftover bit of our profile cutout. So there you have it. It's fairly basic. It looks pretty nice though, and you could cut this as it is, but I want to really jazz it up using some of the tools that we just went through. So let's go now and close this down and look straight down on our job. Let's reset our toolpath preview so we have a solid block of material, and we're going to hide that just for a second and then turn back on our vector. So right now we're on the top side of our job, and so what we're going to do is to start to think about how we're going to create this texture. Now if I zoom out a little bit and kind of scroll over and I look at my layers here, you're going to see I've got some layers that we haven't seen yet. So I'm going to go ahead first of all and create my vector texture. Okay, so if I go to my 2D view for a second, you'll see I've got this box over here to the right hand side of my job, and I'm going to use this to create a vector texture. Now this is going to be in a circle, so this is what I thought was just about 1/4 of a circle-ish, that I think that if I copied that 4 times around the circle, I would have a nice little texture once I make it fit properly. So let's just select that box and go into our vector texture creator. And we are going to have a 0-degree angle, that's fine. Max spacing is 15 millimeters, amplitude 5, 45, all looks good. Let's preview that. And well, that's not quite exactly what we want. So let's just go and change the amplitude to be a little bit more. Let's make it 10. And let's make our wavelength, that's all right. Let's just preview that. That's looking a bit better. And let's change our spacing to be a little less variable. There we go. I'm pretty happy with that, but I'm gonna rotate this 90 degrees. That looks a little bit better. That's more what I would like to have in the end. And maybe I would like to have a few more, a few less lines. That looks pretty good. That's great, great. So let's just click OK, and we've got a nice little texture now we can use. So I'm gonna select those, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go down to copy to another layer, and I've got a layer called distorted vectors. So we're going to copy them there for a second. Let's go up here and turn off our vector texture and turn on our distorted vectors. Now the only thing that's different about those 2 different layers is that I've got 2 arcs here. So remember, as I said, we were actually going to make these bend into a circle a little bit. Well, this is what we're going to use to do that with. Let's just drag this over so we can see this a bit better. If we use our distort selected objects, now the distort tool we don't talk about very much, but it's really quite powerful for distorting text, for taking 3D components and slightly distorting them so they look different than maybe like components that are next to it. And we can use it for something like this, where we're going to make those vectors kind of bend around 1/4 of a circle. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the options that we have here. We can distort within a bounding box, which is really nice for if you've got some nice long text and you want to Bezier the tops of those to kind of get them to bend in like a little curve like that, or maybe you want them to kind of swoop like that. You can do that with that. It's really quite nice for that. You can do it above a single line if you'd like to, so you can have a wavy curve and you can distort things on that if you'd like to. Or we can go between two curves, and that's what we're going to choose there. So right below that, you're going to see three things that we need to fulfill before we can use this tool. We need a selection of vectors. Okay, we need to hold down our shift key, and we need a top edge, and we need a bottom edge, and then we can just apply that and you'll see what we get. Now you can see what I'm doing, right? We've taken that sort of random vector texture that we created, and now we've sort of distorted it between those two arcs. So that's great. So let's close this down. Now when we do that, what happens is it stays inside of this sort of distort mode. So I need to remember that in a minute when I go to do some editing to these. So we're going to right click on these, and I'm going to copy these to another layer again, and I'm going to call these trimmed vectors. Now we'll take a look at that layer. We'll hide this one and we'll show this one. So what I have on this layer is we just copied over those vectors that we've distorted, but I also have this larger profile vector. And like I had said originally, most often you're going to want to cut outside of the actual piece that you're going to keep. So with this clock, for instance, I actually want to cut outside of that, so I'm coming into it, opposed to starting on the edge where I'd have kind of a cup shape. So I really don't want that effect. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select those vectors. I'm going to right click, and this is important to remember to do. You need to convert those to vectors. Remember, I've distorted those, and so it's kind of still in this distort mode. So I need to get it out of that by converting those vectors, or converting them to vectors. And now they're individual vectors, which is really kind of nice. And then what I want to do is go over and use my interactive trim tool and literally just snip, holding down my right mouse button. I can just zip around the outside of here and cut off all those loose ends I don't want. And that's exactly what I need. Now I'm going to grab those, hold down my shift key and grab all of those vectors really quickly. A bit fiddly, but you get them all. That looks really nice. So let's group those. Let's right click and we're going to group those. And then I'm going to hold down my Control, Shift, and H key. That's going to copy those horizontally across my job. Hold down my Shift key again and grab those two. Control, Shift, and V, and that's going to copy them down. Now I have all the vectors that I need to go ahead and to add a texture to the top of this. So let's grab those four groups. And let's go into our, let's close that down. Let's go into our vector, our texturing toolpath. And we can have a look at this. We're going to use those selected vectors. We're going to ramp at the start and at the end. That's going to give me a nice little cup. And that's really important with this, because if I went across the whole face of this, I would have a hard time deciding or finding out the depth that I need to make sure that I don't cut through the back side when I cut the pockets for these. This was my solution. I'm sure there's other ways of doing it, where I'm going to cut this bit of a plateau in the middle. That way I can really figure out what that thickness is in the end. So we're going to make the cut depth of about 12 millimeters, and let's just calculate that. Okay, and let's preview that visible toolpath, and we're going to see what we get. Now that's pretty slick. That looks really neat, and that's using that V-bit that I had selected a minute ago, and you could use that if you wanted to, but I don't want to do that. What I'd really like to do is go back into my toolpath, and I'm going to select a different bit altogether, and we're going to go get that 1-inch ball nose that I showed you earlier, and we'll select that. And let's recalculate that toolpath based on that. And let's preview that visible toolpath. And we'll see now it's going to go ahead and cut out the shape close to what we had originally. Now, because this is, we're throwing in some variation here, it's going to be different than what I actually cut. So if you recalculate this toolpath again, every time you do it, it's going to look slightly different. So make sure you kind of stop along the way if you find one that you really like, and sort of keep that or save that one off for yourself. Again, it's going to take a few minutes because I've got it set up to a high resolution. This is quite a big cutter because I really wanted to see what was going on when we did this. And again, you can fiddle around with different size V-bits, different size ball nose end mills. Now in our particular case, I'm really quite fortunate because this V-bit, or not this V-bit, this ball nose that we're going to use has a really large shank. It's a 1/2 inch shank. So we happen to have a 1/2 inch collet for our machine. So you might be slightly limited to the size of tool that you have, but you know, there's all kinds of things you can do. So you can swap out a 1/4 inch end mill and come up with the same sort of thing in the end if you'd like to. And that looks really great. So let's just go ahead and preview these tool paths in conjunction with that. It looks great. And let's go to the back side and let's preview all of these tool paths on the back side. And there we have it. There's our clock. That looks really neat as a sunburst kind of shape. And if you're not quite happy with that, go in and fiddle around with that texture toolpath. Now, another thing I want to point out before we go too much farther is the order that I cut these in. I made sure to cut my chamfer first. That way I'd have less chipping, I was hoping in the end. I think that worked out really well. Then I'm going to cut my texture next, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut my half cutout and then my dowel holes, making sure that you fit those dowels in to be sure that they fit. If they don't fit, then you're going to have to make them a little bit bigger. And on the back side, I just cut them in the order that you saw, the bigger pocket, the smaller pocket, the hole in the middle, and then the cutout pass. Now that's pretty much it in the end. And you can see how fun it is to use all of those different tools. And don't forget that distortion tool is there for you to use and have some fun with that. You can come up with all kinds of neat ways to bend things and shape things. To have a look into that. Okay, now let's go ahead and have a peek at what it looked like when I was actually cutting this on the CNC machine in the labs. I'm really happy with the way this turned out. Using those 3 different tools in your software, the Vector Texture Creator, the Texture Toolpath, and the Distortion tool, you can do all kinds of great things. And don't forget to switch up the tools, play with those options, and see what kind of textures you can make. Now, I only do one other thing different about this file, and I did change it in the file that you're going to get, is I didn't make the pocket for the mechanism quite deep enough. So there was a little bit too much wood, so I couldn't use the little nut that you get with the mechanism to hold it in place. I don't think it's a big deal, but if that's an issue for you, then just make sure all your depths are set up appropriately. And a top tip, and it's really important to remember this, if you're going to use the toolpaths that I created with that big ball nose, make sure you check those feeds and speeds and make sure they're safe and appropriate for your machine. Well, hope you liked that video. If you do, please give us a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to our channel and like to see more content like this, please subscribe. If you have any thoughts about this project or any comments about it, please leave those below and I'll get to those as soon as I can. Until next time, have lots of fun with your software. Don't forget to dig right in there and make something really cool. And until next time, we'll see you later.